I'm Mike Hanewald, field agronomist with Beck's Hybrids, and have two updates today of what we're seeing as we move late into the grain fill period here into mid to late August. First we'll talk about late planted corn and the potential need for fungicide, and then we'll also talk about sudden death syndrome in soybeans. So starting off with corn. We've been fortunate that we haven't had a lot of severe disease yet this year, and most of our earlier planted corn, planted in the month of May or earlier, is getting well into the dough stage and dent stages now, to where our diseases aren't near as big of a concern. And so if we got it sprayed with fungicide, that's great, but if we have those early planted acres that we haven't sprayed with fungicide and we haven't seen the disease yet, those are probably safe at this point. Because when the disease infects late in the season past the dough stage, we don't tend to see as big of a need for fungicide, because by the time the disease advances, the corn's beginning to shut down the plant anyway. But our late planted corn is where we want to take a look. And so there was a significant number of corn acres planted in Ohio in the month of June. And so just encourage you this week to get out and take a look at those acres and just see what you're seeing as far as disease pressure goes. I have started to see some gray leaf spot starting to climb up the plant. And so as a reminder, if you see gray leaf spot anywhere above the ear on the plant and you're prior to the dough stage in corn, the R3 or the R3 milk stage or earlier, you want to go ahead and make a fungicide application. That would probably be a smart move. Northern corn leaf blight, if you see that, see a northern lesion on at least half the plants in the field, that's the threshold to spray. And then tar spot, if you see tar spot anywhere on the plant in the field prior to the dough stage, would be a good idea to spray fungicide. I have started to get a few more reports of tar spot and hearing about that across the northern part of Ohio. So far, all the reports that I've heard of and all of it where I've seen personally has been in fields that are well past the dough stage, and so we're really not concerned about yield loss for those fields, but the late planted corn is our biggest concern. So here in a field of corn planted on June 1st, it is very late milk stage, just getting to the dough stage, but this is also only 100-day corn. This is 5077. And so we would expect it to be some of the earliest maturing that we would see across the state. So if you have corn planted in June, encourage you to take the time to take a look, see what you see. Again, you're looking for disease, gray leaf spot or northern corn leaf blight at the ear or above, or tar spot anywhere on the plant, and make a fungicide application. Our temptation might be to think of this late planted corn as not worth the investment of a fungicide application. However, we've actually seen a pretty good response in PFR, as you can see on your screen there, about double the return on investment for late planted corn as opposed to earlier planted corn, simply because this corn's more vulnerable to disease because it's not as far along through its grain fill period. So definitely take a look at that and make an application if needed. I also wanted to talk today about something we're seeing in soybeans. Sudden death syndrome has really started to show up in a pretty wide area across northern Ohio. And so you look across the field and you can see some yellowing areas show up, usually kind of some random patches. The worst places we've been seeing it have been on sandier soils where we've got a history of soybean cyst nematode, because soybean cyst nematode seems to make sudden death syndrome show up much more severe and a little bit earlier. But then we've also been seeing it in some wetter soils, more compacted areas where it might have been a little bit wet at planting time. So sudden death, actually the infection occurred back at planting. So when the first root breaks the seed coat of that soybean and begins to emerge, if the Fusarium pathogen that causes sudden death is present in the soil and we have plenty of water in the soil, that infection can occur, which is why our best protection against sudden death is seed treatments. But if you take a look at the foliar symptoms here, you can see we've got some mild foliar symptoms and then some very severe symptoms, where you kind of go from yellow to brown very quickly there, and usually in between the leaf veins you can see that how those veins differentiate those lesions that we're seeing. So those are the foliar symptoms you're looking for. But the challenge is that sudden death has the same foliar symptoms as another disease called brown stem rot. And so in order to verify and make sure that we're actually dealing with sudden death and not brown stem rot, we need to split the stem down at the soil line. And so if we split the stem apart here and take a look, you can see that we've got brown discoloration across the width of the stem, especially out near the outer edges of the stem, or that's called the cortex of the stem. Whereas the center of the stem, or the pith, is still somewhat healthy. If we were looking at brown stem rot, the pith, that center part of the stem, would be brown and it would remain healthy in the cortex or the outer edges. So that's how we confirm that we are dealing with sudden death syndrome. As far as recommendations for what to do, unfortunately, sudden death is one of the more frustrating diseases that is a challenge to deal with, because there's not a whole lot we can do at this point. So first thing is grow staging our soybeans. And so if we take a pod from the top 4 nodes of the plant, find our most developed pod in the top 4 nodes and open that pod up, if we have seed that fills the length of the cavity of that pod, so as you can see here with that center seed, it's filling the length of that cavity. That tells us that we are at the R6 growth stage. And if we can get to the R6 growth stage before we see the foliar symptoms showing up, then our yield loss should be fairly minimal. And so even though it looks a little rough in this field, I'm not too concerned about yield loss at this point. If it does show up prior to that R6, then we might see some more yield loss from sudden death, killing that plant prematurely. The other thing we can do is just make note of the fields where we're seeing this, because if we're seeing sudden death pressure this year, then chances are our pressure will be increased next year, because the populations of the fungus will have built themselves up. And so if you intend to plant soybeans after soybeans next year in 2023, would strongly encourage you to look at seed treatment options such as Olivo, which could help give you additional protection against sudden death syndrome. So if you have any questions about these or any other agronomic topics, feel free to reach out to myself or your local Beck's representative, and we'd be happy to help.